Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second National Young Writers Festival English is Cancelled reading and panel event. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking today, the Wurundjeri people, as well as the traditional owners of the land on which the National Young Writers Festival takes place, the Awabakal and Wurimi people. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. This is and always will be Indigenous land. We're starting the National Young Writers Festival digital program with English is Cancelled, a reading and panel discussion event, which is returning for the second year in a row to continue our exploration of multilingual writing in Australia, as well as a critique of the colonial presumptions of English. And my name is Dženana Vucic, and I'm joined today by two multilingual writers, Rafeif Ismail and Lise Leitner. I'll just begin with a few words to introduce everybody, and then I'll ask them to introduce their work a little bit, as well as read an extract of their writing. So Rafeif is an award-winning emerging multilingual storyteller and editor based in Boorloo or Perth. Rafeif's work has been published in anthologies and literary magazines across Australia and internationally, with a debut novel forthcoming. Deeply committed to creating diverse works, spaces, and ethical storytelling, Rafeif is also the current managing director of Jed Press and co-editor of Unlimited Futures, speculative, visionary, and black fiction. Lise is a games creative and writer based in Naarm or Melbourne. They worked in marketing and communications for more than 10 years and have worked for cultural institutions and museums in Australia and in their home country of Belgium. As a writer, they've contributed to game titles like Slay the Spire, Trash, and Morpeg Tycoon 2, and they've written articles, game reviews, and short stories for SBS Overland, Joy 94.9, and more. As I said, my name is Dženana Vucic. I'm a Bosnian Australian writer, poet, critic, editor type person, and I'm currently working on my first book, for which I've been lucky enough to receive funding from the Martin Bequest, the Peter Blasey, and the Cat Muscat Fellowships. My book, like a lot of my work, looks at identity, memory, myth, and history making, the Bosnian War, coming to Australia as a refugee, and language. So I might start off with a reading of my own work before I pass on to the other two. So this is a poem that will be coming out in the next issue of Australian Multilingual Writing Project, and it's called To Learn a Mother Tongue. I'll just have some water first, excuse me. I learned sustenance first. Treshnya, jabuka, mlieko, hlieb. Learn to say nisam gladna before I can say that I am. Learn that I must leave food uneaten, since empty plates I want to be filled with samo malo yosh. Then comes movement. Dolazimo, idemo, haimomi, moja čerka je došla. And the whiplash of names, which sound familiar but are not, and which suggest directionality, or at the very least, direction. In the stillness that follows, I learn to call things. Stol, vrvo, list, sviet, nebo. My father is a translator. He touches an object and turns them to sound, stretches his arms across naše selo, and renders the world legible. Speaking the self comes slow, and without intuition. I am not cold, ali hladno je. To know the difference, I must know when to uncouple myself and when to double back. I do not miss you, ali nedostaju si me. Grammar comes slower yet, and forces us into the perpetual present. There is always someone missing, and we can never be sure of who did what to whom, since I conjugate poorly and without regard to grammatical gender. In any case, we do not burden ourselves with syntax. There is too much history to get lost in semantics, and we are more interested in the little things. Jesi, šta ti radiš? Jesi ti gladna? Hajde, hoćeš ti kafu? Drago mi je što si došla. Thank you. Who's next?
Do you want to go, Rafeif?
Sure. That was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing. Kaya, everyone, and salam. My name is Rafeif Ismail. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I am on Wajak Noongar Boja and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm going to be reading a poem primarily in English. It's my first time reading it in a while, so yeah, just heads up with that. Ghosts. I've tried not to speak with the words of ghosts, but sometimes my voice slips between here, there, and the hereafter. The protesters chant, Shuhadana ma matu, Aishin ma thawra, like a prayer. Shuhadana ma matu, Aishin ma thuwar, like hope. Our children become martyrs before they have a chance to live. Shuhadana ma matu, Shuhadana ma matu, Shuhadana ma matu. Our river is a graveyard. الشعب حبيبي وشرياني أداني بطاقة شخصية, said Mahjoub Sharif. And I remember that people bleed out from inside their own bodies. Yet I'm also separate the world to walk away from the footsteps of titans, to ignore the sounds of resistance, rebellion, rebuilding in the name of wellness.
That was so beautiful. I'm kind of regretting going last now after both of you.
It'd be amazing.
Hi everyone, my name is Lisa. I'm originally from Belgium, so my original language, my native language is Flemish, which is a variant of Dutch. So I thought for this event I might read a little bit of a longer poem I wrote, which is in Flemish, so I'll just read a little extract of that. Mijn schouders zaten vol blauwe plekken en sneden en verwondingen. Maar van binnen was het nog zacht, babyzacht bladgoud, glinsterend als dauwdruppels in de morgen en onaangetast, nooit afgelast geluk, dat terugrekte als een kat als de nacht aanbrak, bij het afspelen van de film. Gekrast, glanzend, piepend, stil en toch onschuldig. Geschapen nog voor het hoofd naar buiten steekt en de wereld eert zoals hij echt is. Verweerd van buiten, maar in het midden nog babyzacht en glad, waar hij het bladgoud kan vinden. We stonden geparkeerd in de grote weide, ik en mijn vrienden. Onze hoofden lagen op de dingen die nog komen zouden en te dromen vielen, en op alles wat we zeiden dat zich langzaam verweefde in jonge nacht en nog bedacht werd. Want daar zaten wij nog vol mee, potentieel. Er was geen politiek te veel of te weinig, alles zat nog op zijn plaats en in te rekken. Van misplaatste nostalgie was geen sprake, noch van vertrekken of blijven, of het verrekken van politieke spieren, of wij als naamloze mieren, in het web genaamd carrière en generatie I, dat nog vrij was van alle kwalen van mijn vaders tijd. Ik had geen plichten, enkel jong zijn en verveeld en bedeeld. En in opstand komen, bier drinken en naar sigaretten stinken, en dat verdoezelen met deodorant. Niets was gestrand. Dichten deed ik toen nog niet op papier, want het zat nog in mijn bloed. Here we go. That's me.
Oh, wow. Both of those were incredible. I mean, obviously I couldn't understand yours, Lisa, but the flow of it was really, really enchanting. So thank you both so much for sharing your poems. I think maybe we can start with a question which is kind of perhaps simple, or it sounds simple, but I think it's rather difficult to answer. And that's just, why do you write in another language? When did you start, and what do you find that accomplishes for you? That's 3 questions.
Lisa, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, it's not an easy question, that's for sure. I think for me, it came pretty naturally, because I think growing up in Belgium, one of the first things that I remember being told in the classroom was like, no one in the world speaks Flemish, no one is going to learn it, like start learning a different language like French or English if you want to understand, like the songs on the radio, everything around us was in English. And so it's interesting that I've sort of gotten into like speaking English as like what I feel very much an outsider before I moved to Australia. And then as my writing developed, I really started writing poetry in Flemish because I felt like I really connected with the sound and the rhythm of the language. But when I started writing in English after I spent some time in the UK and then moved to Australia, I found that writing fiction and games and things where I'm like further removed from the narrative, it was almost easier to write in English. So I kind of feel like it's two different parts of my brain that connect with writing in different ways. So, yeah, for me, it sort of naturally kind of came together throughout my career. But I don't know, is that similar for you, Rafeif, or how did that come about for you?
So for me, I think it came about because when I first arrived in Australia, I actually wasn't allowed to speak Arabic. My school decided to ban us from speaking our first language as a way to learn English, um, which was absolutely devastating on like my linguistic capacity because I speak Sudanese Arabic, which is its own language with its own dialect, filled with like the surviving bits of the indigenous languages that were there before colonization. So it did mean that my writing in Sudanese Arabic and now has become sort of this act of reclamation. So I'm trying to keep parts of the language alive, but I'm also trying to keep words that I like that my great grandmother spoke. That I know that if I don't remember, they're not going to be spoken again. Like because yeah, like it's the indigenous languages of the areas my parents are from survived until the 18th century, and then sorry, the 19th century, and then unfortunately, multiple colonizations meant that they were absorbed into Arabic. So yeah, I'm trying really hard to kind of just honor those within Sudanese Arabic, and obviously it's a really um, wild space because there's all that resentment and anger of having to speak a colonial language and then having to do that in English as well. But yeah, it's an interesting balancing act. What about you, Dženana?
Yeah, I think somewhat similar to you, I came to Australia when I was a child. I came from the Bosnian War, and while our school never had like a particular rule about it, it was very much the case that if we could not speak English, we were not, we just weren't catered to in any sense. And so my family embarked on a process of assimilation, which meant that as soon as we could, we just stopped speaking anything other than English at home. Which, yeah, as a child, I'd never realized the loss of that. But growing up and realizing, I had sort of this, what's it called? It's called like received language, when you can kind of understand what's being said, but you can't speak yourself. And then when I returned to Bosnia, I was really surprised to realize what a child I was in the language and how incapable of communicating I was to my friends and family. So I think for me, writing in Bosnian has been a way to travel back to my past and to travel back to my family, but also do that through a medium that I find a bit safer, because writing is as hard and as difficult and as awful as it can be sometimes. It is very much also a safe space for me. And because I work a lot in poetry, it allows me to make a lot of mistakes grammatically, which I need to do because Bosnian has 7 cases and everything is gendered, including the verbs and the adjectives. So I need the flexibility of poetry in that. But yeah, I think for me, it's mostly just a way to come home to Bosnia, in a sense. Yeah. I wonder if that's also maybe something that the two of you feel like. Is there a sense of returning when you write or speak in your like mother tongues? Mother tongue sounds like a weird way to put it as well, to be honest. But is there that sense, or is it a bit different?
There's absolutely a sense of returning when I write and speak in Sudanese Arabic. I think I also feel that returning in like modern standard Arabic, which again, conflicted feelings. But like you, when I started communicating to other folks in Arabic again after so many years of not speaking it, I realized how much of a child I was in the language, especially when my baby cousins could speak and read better than me. Then it was like, oh no. What about you, Lisa?
I think, yeah, I can identify with what both you talked about, in the sense that like it's, if you write, it's a safe space. And I think it's quite interesting that poetry offers that sort of free form, because for me, I feel very like emotionally closest to myself when I write in Flemish. But interestingly, I feel like I've spoken Flemish growing up, but having lived here for 9 years and then going back to Flanders, I often find that I like my Flemish is so dusty that I kind of feel like I've regressed, and I find myself in conversations like with my family, just like looking at a bulb of garlic and being like, "What's the word of that thing on the table?" And they're like, "You mean garlic? You've been like away for way too long, clearly." So that's sometimes made me feel quite conflicted in terms of home and identity. Sort of I feel like I'm often in that really liminal space, like where do I fit? I'm not sure. I feel like sometimes my Flemish is too dusty, but then when I speak English and speak to other Australians, I feel like I have this like small pool of vocab when I talk to other people who are so articulate, and I'm like, I don't feel like I'm fully in control of the English language. So it's always like you're sort of floating in the middle in some ways. And I think yeah, just emotionally, that's what I tend to return to in writing. If I'm in that headspace, sort of, how do I feel like emotionally most closely connected to story and to what I want to write about? And often that's when I return to Flemish. That's poetry. That's that rhythm. That's those things that kind of transcend language. So yeah, sorry, I don't know if that was a coherent answer, but yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of transcending language, what can you guys say in another language but not in English, or vice versa?
I feel like proverbs are a really interesting one. Like things that when I just arrived here, I used to say to my partner, like, "Oh, like, you know, the monkey's out of the sleeve now," and she would be like, "What do you mean?" And I was like, "Okay, that's clearly something people don't say here," but it would be like, "The cat's out of the bag" or something. Usually, there's like a translation. But every now and then, you come across like a word that's like deeply intertwined with just like cultural habits or rituals from home that there is no word for. Sort of like that that feeling of like in Flemish there, and in German there's a word for it too. That's sort of like the feeling in the tips of your fingers is like a noun that they use for like feeling at home in the language and feeling in control of the language. And it's like things like that that kind of communicate nuances that are important to me culturally, but then because I've moved to Australia where people perceive it differently, there's not quite a word for it. So I find that that's where often I find myself reaching to poetry, because you can take however long you need to communicate that particular nuance in language. But yeah, how about you, Dženana?
I think I have two responses. I think the first response is that I think what I can say in Bosnian that I can't in English is or like I can use Bosnian and English to express a sort of like being stretched between places that I think if I were only to write in English wouldn't it wouldn't manifest that feeling. And I do think that there's like a big part of me that does very much feel like I have one foot over there and one foot here. And I think if I was to only write in English, it would make it feel like I was a lot more comfortable in the habitus that is here. So I think writing in Bosnian is, as bad as my Bosnian is, it's able to express some of that disconnection and some of that yearning and some of that that I can't in English. And then there's also a lot of stuff I don't necessarily want people to know, but I can hint to it in Bosnian without explicitly saying it. But you've also made me think of there's like two words that I really love in Bosnian that don't have any English translation, and one of them is sevda, and it actually comes from Turkish, or it comes from Arabic via Turkish, and in Bosnian it means this like sense of like contentment in how bad things are, or like this sort of like, it's like this mix of like yearning but satisfaction, and it's a sense of like things are bad but we can still enjoy life, and I really like that word because I think you see it a lot in Bosnia just in general. It's not a very wealthy country and people don't have very many opportunities, but they are very happy people in a way that I found really challenging, because I came from this sort of Western, we must like be doing things and getting to places on time, and like, if you say you're going to be somewhere at 10 p.m., you are there at 10 p.m. I don't know why we're going anywhere at 10 p.m. That's rather late, but regardless. And then sort of tied in with that is this word rahatluk, which is like sort of savoring or enjoying, and you don't do rahatluk by yourself, you do it with people. So it's when you're maybe like sitting around and just like drinking coffee and I don't know, smoking cigarettes and like cracking walnuts, and no one's really doing anything, and it's not really that exciting at the end of the day, but it is like, yeah, a sense of just like being with and being happy with, and I really like those words because I really struggled with that in Bosnia. I really came and I was like, it was a cultural adjustment to realize that if someone said they would come to my house at 10 in the morning, they would not. I might see them at 3. I mean, they had some people to stop in at, like they had some coffees to drink. And at first I was really annoyed, but then I realized I don't have anything to do either, so it's completely fine. So I think I really like those words because it helped me sort of shift my focus and shift my direction, which I think has always been very like driven and I'd say rather narrow almost in a lot of ways. I felt like I needed to do certain things and do them right and do them on time, to more of a reality we can just sort of enjoy the moment, enjoy the people you're with, and that's equally important, if not more important. Anyway, so I've gone on for a bit. What about you, Rafeif?
I love both of your answers. I was just thinking, Dženana, the first word you said reminds me of the Arabic word sabr, which is like patience and fortification through hard times. And it's kind of one of those words that you say like during, like especially the hardest times in life. And I've never found a word in English that can, bridge that gap of, being like comforting, but also like you can't say to someone be patient in English and have that come off as comforting. So I think for me, Arabic and Sudanese Arabic especially is a language of care. And as a writer, but also as someone who works in healthcare, I do find a disconnect between the languages that we use to express care, physically, mentally, emotionally, and as well as like, and how that's expressed across different languages. So if I am speaking to a Sudanese person and asking how they are, the response that they'll give me encompasses their whole self. But if I'm speaking to someone who speaks English as a first language, oftentimes the response is very specific and right there, and you have to kind of almost dig deep to get to every part. And I think that kind of makes it, like, I'm a naturally anxious person, so I do not do follow-up questions. So yeah, English kind of feels like this wall to me between like my whole self and the whole self of the other person that I'm speaking to. But out of necessity, I have to write in it, and that's why I add Sudanese Arabic when I can. And like you both mentioned, through the mediums of like poetry and most recently theatre and screenwriting, I've been able to kind of incorporate Sudanese Arabic into English and make it a bit more, because for me, Arabic is a language of poetry. So I've never been able to, justify my writing of poetry in English. I just keep thinking, oh no, this is not what I'm trying to say. There's an ocean of meaning that is missing. But I do love the words that you shared, Dženana, because another word that I adore in Arabic is musamara, which is kind of like basically in the evenings you sit around with your friends and you're chatting, you're watching the sunset, you're ending the day, you're like probably smoking shisha, you're eating, and you're just talking, and it's like musamara. And all of that is just that entire scene encompassed in one word. So yeah.
That sounds so lovely. All of those words sound so lovely. I'm kind of curious to hear from you both. Like, it's so interesting to hear about those differences in care that are communicated through language. Like, how has that influenced the topics and the stories that you write about for both of you?
This question is too hard. Maybe I'll give it a go. So did you ask how has, is it the language in particular or the language around care?
Both, to be honest, but sort of like how I find it really interesting how, like, through culture, language emphasizes ideas like care and asking how people are in different ways. And I found, like, for example, for me, that was a very strange thing to adapt to when you walk into a shop in Australia and people ask, like, how are you? It's like very unusual. And so I still see it when friends from home come visiting. They're like, oh, you know, like my leg's kind of hurting. And like they give like a full story to a shop assistant. And they're like, oh, no, you're just meant to be like, I'm fine. And then how are you? And I always found that quite poetic because it's like you were saying, Rafeif, like if you ask someone, how are you? It's kind of lovely that a person gives you a complete whole answer with their whole self sort of poured into it, as you said. So for me, that sort of influenced my writing in Flemish even more, that I kind of want to celebrate that aspect of the language and maybe influence some of the characters that I write about. So I was just wondering how you both experienced that through your writing.
That's so funny that you say that. I've been living in Germany, which is also not a place where you ask the shopkeeper how they're doing, but I absolutely did. And they just looked at me like, what? Like, didn't even bother responding, just like looked like, huh?
I love that as a measure, like a place where you do not ask the shopkeeper how they are. It's great.
I think in relation to Bosnian though, and I'm a little bit reluctant to even answer this way because I'm a little bit trepidatious about entering the whole like, oh, other cultures think about food in a very different way. But I think it is true that like how my family shows love is through making sure that I'm fed and asking if I'm hungry and if I'm cold and if my kidneys are covered, because if they're not, I might get a brain inflammation. So I think that a lot of the way that I've come to express care, I think, or like hint at care, has now become around food or around naming food, which I think has, for me become a sort of like a code word, or like it hints at this care that is enacted towards me, more so than explicit words. Though there are like lots of fun ones. My family always calls me Yadnichuk, for example, which I think is very sweet. And it's like, oh, you poor thing. But sometimes has a hint of diddums. And I haven't found out how to work that into a poem, but I think there's a lot of sweet nicknames, a lot of the closeness of being held by people that I'm trying to capture. But I honestly am not sure that my language skills are good enough yet to meaningfully do that without merely sort of hinting at it. Yeah. What about you, Rafeif?
I so feel you on the not feeling language skills are good enough to say things without merely thinking about it, because yeah, that's absolutely how I am in Sunnis Arabic. I think similar to Bosnian culture, I guess. Yeah, we show a lot of our care in how someone is provided for. So I have found that I've been trying to kind of do that in English, weirdly enough, now that I've gotten older, like asking my friends if they've eaten, if they've hydrated, as a like, please know that I care about you. Even though it does sound really awkward and clunky in in English. Um, I have realized that like compliments and ways to express beauty in Arabic are like so complex that there is no way that I can do that in English. So I've been listening to a lot of music recently. I've been listening to my parents' music collection. So I've been listening to all the 70s music, basically. Um, and like the gorgeous lyrical way that people show how they care for each other, but not just each other, but the community, the nation. And then you see that the nation is a person, and the person is like, there's just this feedback loop, which then makes it so understandable why there's such a strong resistance movement against the dictatorship back home, because yeah, we see every person as a country, like as part of the country. And yeah, so um, I don't know how to like encapsulate that sort of like care for both the small picture and the bigger picture simultaneously in English. But I'm trying to work it into my writing. And yeah, I found that writing in science, like writing in the genre of science and speculative fiction, is the closest I can get to expressing things the way I really want to express them, because you kind of are allowed to break away from the rigidness of English. And it's like the closest I can get to like the oral storytelling traditions that I grew up with. So yeah, I guess I would ask, how do you as a reader respond to work done by your favorite multilingual writers?
So one of my favorite multilingual writers is Safia El Hilo, who writes in Arabic. And I don't speak Arabic, although my family is Muslim, so there are certain words that she uses that are sort of just shared, like Alhamdulillah, Bismillah, these kind of things that my family also says. And what I really love about reading multilingual writing, like hers or anybody else's, is when a word is left and it's untranslated, and it might be rendered in like what is it called, like Roman text, like that script, or it might be in Arabic or Cyrillic, or in like Mandarin or Chinese characters rather, and there's this like gap that you're forced into because you do not know what sound fills that space, and I really like that pause, which sort of I feel like suspends meaning and suspends the presumptions of English, because I think this is across all languages, but when you're listening to people, like your brain sort of leaps ahead and you are filling in where they're going. So you have an expectation of what they're going to say, and it kind of follows that track. And so when on the page that you find yourself facing something you just don't know how to fill, I find that such a rewarding space as a reader, because it kind of forces you to like stop and pause and break for a moment. And then whatever happens in that stop and pause, I feel like can be super productive or super interesting. And I particularly like it for myself because I feel that way a lot in Bosnian. When my family's speaking to me, there's a level in which I understand, and then someone says Zmigovac, and I'm like, all right, like whatever that means. And so there's like it kind of reflects in a way that pause or that break that happens within my mother tongue. And that can be kind of confronting and annoying in some way. But then when you read multilingual writers like Safia Hilo or like Evelyn Araluan in one of her poems, whose name I've just completely blanked on. It will come back to me, never mind. But that sort of the struggle or the attempt to reach back to language or to like connect back to that with people who are perhaps not like at a native speaker level within their language, I find so comforting and so interesting and so I don't know, so enchanting to be a part of and to watch. I feel like I veered very far away from what the question was, but I like the break. I think is the end of the story.
I love that. Also, love Safia. She's Sudanese, just so you all know. She's
I
Sudanese.
didn't know.
So just, yeah. I love the way she, in one of her poems, she talks about how Hawa and Hawa are like both so connected, like breath and love, and how the words are almost indistinguishable by sound. And I think that sort of encapsulates such a big part of the culture that, yeah, I just love how she portrayed that. Lisa, what about you?
Gosh, that's so beautiful, by the way, and really lovely. I can, identify with all of the things that were said here so far, but I think that pause is something that I really appreciate as well. I think it's something really powerful, especially in poetry. I think growing up, I read a lot of like Spanish translated poetry. My grandparents were from Poland originally, but fled, so I don't speak any Polish, but I know that for when I was growing up, they did a lot of like translated Polish poets where you had Polish on one side and then the translation on the other side. And then some poems were a mix. And I just feel like it creates a space where you're welcomed into someone else's experiences, and it just feels like a privilege, really. And it's nice to inhabit other languages in the sense that it sort of, yeah, forces you to sort of reflect on yourself and how language kind of like see it functions as a filter to see the world through. So um, interestingly, I'm sort of at a stage where I'm experimenting with that in my own poetry, like jumping between the two. But it feels so different creating that space actively through writing versus reading it. I think as a reader, it just feels like you're on this beautiful journey in the ocean, sort of um, experiencing as it comes. And I think as a writer, I am still sort of trying to figure out how to wield language in that way. So, yeah, I hope that was a coherent answer.
On that, I just wanted to ask, actually, you said something about feeling welcomed in the other language, and I think that's very true, but I'm also intrigued as to how much welcoming you do when you're writing in Sudanese Arabic or in Flemish. So, for example, like, do you, for an English language audience, would you include translations or pronunciation guides, or do you, maybe put those words in italics? Like, how do you sort of navigate the space of what the reader might understand, assuming a very broad reader, so perhaps someone who can speak English and maybe another language, but perhaps not our native tongues?
When I first started writing, it was during that era where everyone was putting words that aren't in English in italics. I'm not sure if that hazy memory of the early, like late 2010s. And so I followed that trend for a while, but it never really fit because, yeah, I just didn't know how to, yeah, um, how to make a natural shift if I was distinguishing one language from the other. Um, Recently, what I've been doing in my practice is I've very deliberately not put any translation or context guides. And in co-editing Unlimited Futures, we had writers who wrote in First Nation languages of this continent, but also Afro-Black writers who wrote in their first languages. And some of them chose to include translations and others chose not to. But as editors, we made the very deliberate choice of not putting footnotes or any sort of pronunciation guide. It was just kind of like, hey, this is how this language exists within the context that we're giving. And I feel like we did that deliberately as an act of resistance, as a almost like a cancellation of English, some would say. Yeah. What about you, Lisa?
I used to italicize or include some translations, but I've actually stopped doing that and started using the form on the page a little bit more to be a bit more experimental. There's one poet who's really well known in Flanders from around the turn of the century who did a lot of, I'm not sure what the English term is, but like figurative poetry, forming shapes on the page with the words. So I've sort of been experimenting with that and letting the piece as a whole on the page sort of communicate a story to the reader, and kind of giving the reader the freedom to fill that in however they want. And that's actually been kind of freeing in a way, because you're not really bound as much to a reader from a particular background as I would have maybe felt like in the past, that I that I owed them an explanation, which has sort of been an interesting evolution, maybe. So, yeah, I don't know. That's sort of my 2 cents at the moment. But yeah,
Love that.
yeah.
I might throw in my 2 cents as well, but then probably soon thereafter we need to wrap up. But I think much like the both of you, I started off doing the italics thing, and maybe trying to provide a bit more contextual clues. So I'll say the word first in Bosnian and then say it afterwards in English so they understand. But I'm less interested in doing that now, except insofar as it serves the poem. So, for example, the one I read at the start, like I learned sustenance first, and thereafter I named some foods. And that's about the biggest clue I'd give. I think my exception to that is for the Australian Multilingual Writing Project, which also asks for a pronunciation guide and a translation guide. And you don't have to give it, of course. But I quite like it because I like the project of it. And I think that being that the project is about multilingual writing broadly, and I think the people reading it are probably quite interested in different languages, I feel it's a slightly safer space to do that, or the meaning behind providing that translation and that pronunciation guide is quite different to doing it in, like a lit journal where maybe the editors are both white, or I don't know why I said both. I think most of them just have the one editor. But the editors are white, or the translation or poetry editor maybe doesn't come from a multilingual background themselves, and so it doesn't feel necessarily like you're being invited into sharing what you want to share, but rather that you're being invited to sort of translate yourself as well. But anyway, I think we probably should be wrapping things up because it is getting nigh on 9 p.m. But maybe if there's anything anyone wants to say before we do go, any extra thoughts or lingering queries?
You are all absolutely amazing. And I'm so super excited to see your events across the festival, but also your upcoming projects. Tell me what's on the horizon or what's going on at the moment.
Yeah. Cool. That's a great question. I didn't even think to ask that. For me, I'm currently just plugging away on some short stories, working on a novel that I'm hoping to finish before I'm like 89 years old. I sometimes have those dreams where you're on your deathbed and you're like, it's done. And I'm like, oh, God. I hope it'll be earlier than that. Other than that, I think in this festival, I have 2 more events coming up tomorrow. One about podcasting stuff, which I'm really excited about, and one about a room of our own, which is about the notion of femininity and gender in writing and what that means. So if you're around, come say hi, come listen.
Oh, that sounds really good. I don't have anything on that I haven't already said, so I'm working on this book. It's going to be great. I promise you. It's basically writing itself. It's not writing itself. It's not being written. But I am currently visiting. So I've been living in Berlin during Corona on account of getting stuck there. Essentially, it's a long and boring story. But I'm currently visiting Nam, and I'll be going back to see my family in various states. So that's what I'm most excited about at the moment. So no writing there. However, I do have an event with Rafeif for this festival one more time. So I'm super excited about that. It's called Insert Self Here, and it's about the self in writing. And it's going to be on the last day of the festival, which I cannot remember what day that is anymore, because what is time? It's a Sunday.
Time is cancelled. It is.
Cool. Looking forward to that.
It's going to be great whenever it is.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you for everyone who's been listening / watching. I assume you can do both. And have a great rest of the festival.
Have a beautiful festival weekend, everyone. And yeah, we'll see you on the other.